So it's a great pleasure. I was saying that already in our thoughts this summer, the name of David Haskell came out as someone who could make an incredible contribution to our conversation. Then we realized that Massimo was actually a reader of your books. So again, there was a system in circle that was somehow working well together. So it's a great pleasure to have David Haskell here. We will also speak tomorrow at the same hour. We took the advantage to have him in Europe. I understood yesterday from him that it's the first time that he speaks not in Italian but in Italy. He will speak in English, so I hope it's fine for you. And I'll leave. So thanks a lot for coming here and for your generous contribution. So today the talk will focus about one of his books, the Song of the Trees, while tomorrow will be focused on this other book, which here is in the Italian translation. Also, the other book, Il canto degli alberi, tradotto, is translated in Italian. So I leave Gaia to get some more information about David, and thank you again for being here.
Grazie a tutte e a tutti per essere qui oggi. Giusto qualche nota pratica rispetto a questo programma pubblico, perché questo programma pubblico si articola in momenti e incontri pomeridiani, ma durante le mattine noi svolgiamo dei workshop, dei laboratori, quindi una parte importantissima di questo programma pubblico è legata al coinvolgimento attivo di studentesse e studenti. Quindi io desidero ringraziare tutte le persone che sono arrivate oggi qui apposta da Bologna e da Milano e da Venezia. E desidero ringraziare sentitamente l'Università UAV di Venezia, la NABA, la Nuova Accademia di Belle Arti, l'Accademia di Bologna, l'Accademia di Belle Arti di Bologna, il Sound Studies Hub, che è un centro di ricerca che nasce in seno all'Università UAV, di cui alcuni nostri ospiti sono parte attiva e che è il primo centro di ricerca transdisciplinare legato agli studi sonori che abbiamo in Italia. Desidero ringraziare il NISH, the New Institute Center for Environmental Humanities di Ca' Foscari, che è il nostro partner. E desidero dire un grazie speciale alla Fondazione Ugo e Olga Levi, che ci supporta, di Venezia, che ci supporta nella ricerca e nell'ospitalità dei nostri invitati e delle nostre invitate. E infine un grazie sentito a della Gnecchi, che è una studentessa di arti visive e studi curatoriali allo UAV, che ci sta supportando anche nell'assistenza curatoriale come parte integrante della sua formazione. Allora, qualche dettaglio pratico, velocissimo, rispetto al fatto che noi passeremo dall'inglese all'italiano senza soluzione di continuità. E questa è una scelta che ovviamente implica un'opacità di contenuto, ma di fatto siamo anche soggetti sonori un pochino in maniera un po' più ampia, non soltanto soggetti parlanti. Quindi io desidero anche scusarmi con le persone che non sono fluenti in entrambe queste lingue. And we will switch from Italian to English, and this is a choice that implicitly is with a sort of opacity between us, so I apologize with who don't understand Italian or English. E infine desidero dire anche che questo programma pubblico è pensato proprio come una costruzione di una comunità temporanea di persone che si incontrano, che si trovano e che sono in relazione attorno a questi territori di indagine che abbiamo individuato rispetto all'ascolto. Quindi invito tutte le persone qui presenti nella lingua che desiderano a intervenire, porre domande, condividere pensieri, riflessioni e quant'altro. Il tema di giugno è legato, come diceva appunto Luca, alla fiducia nello sfondo, quindi alla relazione diretta e costante con la natura, perché l'esperienza sonora e quindi l'ascolto anche non è un sistema isolato, ma vive all'interno di ecosistemi complessi che sono sempre costantemente in relazione con i processi esistenziali e con le contingenze presenti della situazione. Così potremo quindi incominciare a cambiare forse prospettiva rispetto anche all'ascolto e pensare all'ascolto non esclusivamente come un programma legato all'individualità dell'essere umano e al soggetto umano soltanto, ma è un programma ben più ampio che coinvolge direttamente appunto soggetti umani e soggetti non umani e che si nutre della ricchezza, della diversità e dello scambio reciproco tra queste soggettività. Ecco quindi che ascoltare può essere inteso anche come un mezzo per contribuire al contesto, a quella trama caotica e bellissima di cui siamo parte, che poi è lo sfondo, quello che Attila Faravelli a lui piace chiamarlo le pieghe della realtà. E quindi diamo un benvenuto a David Haskell. I just quick introduce your bio. David George Haskell is a writer and a biologist. His books about forest people, sensory richness of life, have received several honors and awards, including the National Academy's Best Book Award, Iris Book Award, Reed Environmental Writing Award, and National Outdoor Book Award for Natural History Literature, among others. David is a professor at the University of the South in Senewi, Tennessee, a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, and a Guggenheim Fellow. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Gaia. Thank you, Luca. Massimo, such a pleasure, such an honor to be here with you this afternoon to talk about the sounds, the songs of trees, and what an amazing place to do this in. We have the wind stirring the voices of the trees around us. We have music from above, and particularly from the installation inside, that are shaped by wood, and so we're literally immersed in the sounds of trees. So whatever I add to it is going to be a little frosting, a little decoration on the top. I hope I can offer a few interesting ideas, but it really is an honor for me to be here with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work listening to individual trees in different places around the world. And please, if you've got thoughts and questions, I'll leave some time at the end and we can have a little dialogue, and I'll be here for the next couple of days and we'll be happy to chat with you, or you can find me online and send your comments that way. So my question underlying my little project of listening to trees was, what can we learn by returning again and again to individual trees, sitting down and being quiet for a change, and listening? So directing our ears, our fingertips, our minds, our emotions to the lives of trees to see what that will reveal for us. So it's perhaps a parallel form of deep listening, deep in the sense that the trees that I selected, there was one in Jerusalem, one in the Amazon rainforest, one in the boreal forests of Canada, one in New York City. I went back over many years again and again to that same tree to sit with the tree, to listen, to talk to people whose lives were intimately connected with the tree, and try to discern some strands of story, some strands of personality. What is the history of this tree? What is its relation to others? And then again and again, whether I was in the middle of the city or out in a place where humans seem to have a smaller connection, I found that trees were always about interconnection and community. So these trees seem to be individuals, and yet if we look at the cellular level, the ecological level, the physiological level, trees are always interacting with other beings, and in fact they gain their life through that relationship. So a lot of what I'll talk about, I'll start talking more about individual tree personalities and move on to talk about trees in their communal form. So listening to trees has a long and very august place in many different traditions. And so I'm going to quote very briefly from the book of Chuang Tzu, so one of the foundational texts of Taoism, and this is Martin Palmer's translation. So this is from the 4th century BCE. So, and this is Master Yu and Master Chi discussing, and Master Chi says, the vast breadth of the universe, this is called wind. Sometimes it is unmoving, and when it moves, it makes the 10,000 openings resound dramatically. Have you not heard it? Like a terrifying gale, mountains and forests are stormed by it. Great trees 100 spans around with dips and hollows are like noses. They're like mouths, like ears, like sockets, like cups, mortars, pools, and gullies. They sound like a crashing wave, a whistling arrow, a screech, sucking, shouting, barking, wailing, moaning. The winds ahead yowling, yee. Those behind crying, whoo. Light breezes make gentle sounds when the typhoon makes a great din. And when the typhoon has passed, all goes quiet again. Have you not witnessed this disturbance settle down again? For Taoists then, tree sounds were part of the expression of what they called the vast breadth of the universe. And trees have many other places in Taoist texts, not just as metaphors, but as guides, literal guides. And what a contrast that is to many parts of our industrialized societies now, where we regard often trees merely as resources, objects to be converted from one form into another and generate income through that. We don't often in our economies, we don't recognize trees as the living beings, the living cousins to us that they are. Trees are also present and speaking in the biblical tradition, that place where we don't normally imagine animistic voices of trees emerging, but this is from the book of Judges. The trees went forth on a time to anoint a king over them. And they said unto the olive tree, reign thou over us. But the olive tree said, should I leave my fatness, wherewith by me they honor God and man, and go and be promoted over the trees? And the tree said to the fig tree, come thou and reign over us. But the fig tree said, should I forsake my sweetness and my good fruit to be promoted over the trees? And they said unto the vine, come thou and reign over us. And the vine said, no, should I leave my wine, which cheereth God and man, and to be promoted over the trees? And then the tree said to the bramble, come thou and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if you anoint me king, then put your trust in my shadow. If not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. So tree voices and the agency of trees are present even in the Bible, that place which we normally regard as a rather non-animistic text. And yet here the trees are in voice, and each has a personality. And notably, the olive tree, the fig tree, even the vine reject human notions of hierarchy, of dominion, of reigning over. They desire to live in their niche, in right relationship to others. The crown in this story ultimately goes to the thicket, the bramble, the place of shadow and thorn and confusion of blackberry twigs and stems. The trees in this passage subvert the idea of a singular trunk-like authority. So trees in their voices have long been known to carry meaning that we might pay attention to, and here I'll discuss their ecological meaning by listening quite literally and metaphorically to trees. So listening to trees, we hear the mulberry now. And a few moments ago, the blackbird was singing from the top of the mulberry, singing with joy that here is a tree full of fruit. And the voice of the mulberry, of course, is different from the voice of the honey locust or the cherry tree, and very different from the voice of the pine. And in the physicality of sound, in those differences of texture and timbre and pitch and rhythmicity that we hear within trees, we learn about the architecture of the tree. How is this tree built? How does it relate to the rest of the world? So we can hear their personalities, just as we can hear the personalities of other human beings in the voice, the tension that's held in the voice or the relaxation in the voice, or the characters and different species of birds. So there are lots of apps and CDs out there about identifying birds by ear. How about if we put a CD or an app out, how to identify the trees of Italy, the trees of Europe, the trees of the world by ear alone, or maybe by the vibrations that come through our fingertips. So the first thing we learn by listening is that each tree has its own voice. The wind is the most frequent interlocutor, personality that reveals the tree to us. But of course the wind, the rain, ice, snow, hail all make different sounds, percussive sounds in particular, as they play through the tree. Some little chickadees up above joining in here. One particularly striking example of this are different kinds of pine trees. So pine trees that grow in the lowlands generally have long, flexible pine needles that can blow around in the wind, and they make a very gentle whooshing sound, quite kind of low frequency sound. But pine trees that grow up in the mountains, maybe they're just the same species as the one in the lowlands, or different species that grow up in the mountains, have to deal with ice and snow that lands in their boughs and threatens to break the pine needles. And so these trees have very thick pine needles. They're not soft. They're almost like wire brushes sticking out. And so when the wind hits this wire brush, the wind is torn apart and it makes this incredible rushing sound. And in the US where I live, you can hear this very distinctly in Colorado in the very high mountains, where the ponderosa pine, the slightest little gust of wind into a ponderosa pine tree sounds like a hurricane. The first time I heard it, I was frightened. I wanted to run away from the forest because I thought the trees were all about to fall down. But no, this is just the voice of a tree that is adapted to ice and snow. And we can hear that physiological, morphological adaptation coming out in the sound. The ponderosa pines growing in California, where there's very little ice or snow, have a low, sweet sound. And John Muir wrote all sort of rhapsodic essays about the sweet sound of the ponderosa pine. If he'd lived in Colorado, it would have been an entirely different story, a story of agonies, perhaps. Trees in hot, dry places like olive trees, some of the oaks around the Mediterranean tend to have quite small leaves that are thick, adapted to the drought, so they can keep photosynthesizing even in the middle of summer. And those leaves, of course, don't move much when the wind hits them. When they do move, it's just by a small amount. They make quite high-frequency sounds, completely different voice from a big-leafed oak tree or a sycamore tree, a tree growing with its roots down in or a fig tree. There's an example of a nice fig tree in the bottom of the garden here, growing with its roots in the water near a river or someplace that's well irrigated. Much larger leaves, sometimes that are tapping against each other, much wider spectrum of frequencies. And again, we're hearing how the tree has adapted to its place. The small leaves are adapted to seasonally arid climates. The large leaves do much better on riverbanks. So we learn about the ecological personality of each tree by listening to its voice. And then a favorite time of year of mine is in the autumn when many of those leaves fall to the ground. And our feet get to explore the sonic qualities of different species of leaves. So the sycamore tree, or in the US, the southern magnolia tree, and that's one growing on the waterfront just down the road here, southern magnolia, big glossy leaves. They're quite thick, and underfoot in the autumn they sound like you're stepping on a crab. Crack, this incredible sound. And so we're hearing the strength of the leaves underfoot. Maple leaves, of course, sound completely different from oak leaves. And then when the pine needles fall, it's almost, walking on them is almost like the sound of kindling, of a gentle fire coming through. So in the autumn, I encourage you to do a little bit of sonic exploration. Find that in a child that likes to just jump around and step on things and make them crack. And then follow the sounds back into the story. Why does this tree sound this way, this leaf sound this way compared to this leaf here? And these sounds subconsciously become part of our connection to place. So I live in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the southern United States, where magnolia trees are an important part of the southern culture. People identify with them. They have beautiful white flowers in the springtime. People use them in paintings, they plant them near their homes. And for a lot of people, the sound of the wind in the magnolia leaves and the crunch of the magnolia underfoot is the sound of home. But often that sound of home is taken in subconsciously, and it's not until we sit around and talk about the sounds of trees that people suddenly realize, oh yes, that is the sound of my grandmother's house because she had that big tree out, or that's the sound of walking to school. So think about how each of these sounds not only reveals the personality of the tree, but connects you to your place, whether it's a place you've chosen to be or a place you're staying temporarily. One last tree I'll mention sort of in its physicality and the sound revealed through physicality are palm trees. So the fronds of palms, we think often in a culture a palm is a sign of relaxation. Oh, we're at the beach and there are palm trees and so on. A palm is one of the toughest plants there is. They're growing where there's salt and there are hurricanes and wildfires coming through. And how does a palm tree do this? They have a number of different adaptations, but in their leaves, they actually lay down pieces of sand, so silicate. They have strands of rock running up through their leaves, which is why underfoot a palm sounds almost like gunshots being fired off. It's so loud as you walk on it. Or when you flex the palm frond, incredibly loud sounds coming from it. And you're quite literally hearing the sound of silicate strands breaking as you do that. And of course, for the palm tree, these are the strands that hold the frond through years of assault by the wind. When they burn away, they quickly grow again and lay down new strands of silicate within them. So next time you're around palms, admire them for their strength and resilience. One other thing that's not so related to their sound, but many palms, when they first grow, instead of the little seedling growing up the way most trees grow, the palm tree goes directly down through the sand and then grows back up. And it takes it several years to make that U-turn underneath. And that protects it from fires that are common along the coast. So the fire comes past and maybe burns away the top part, but the little tree is underground. And if you've seen a fallen palm tree, look at the bottom of it, and you'll see a saxophone shape. So where the tree grew, there's a little bit of wood, and then it comes and goes up like this. So they're extraordinarily resilient. And then in this time when we are asked to be more and more resilient, I think there's things we can learn from the palms who've lived on the edges of coasts that have been continually moving in and out. And of course, here in Venice, very aware of sea level rise and so on. Well, there are plants in the lagoon here that have been dealing with sea levels going up and down for millions of years. What could we learn? What could we learn from them? So when we hear the sound, for example, of a pine tree in the mountains, we're quite literally hearing some of the spirit and the energy of the mountain in the sound of the pine tree. And when we hear the wind in a palm frond, that palm is revealing something about the coast itself. So embedded within the sound is the story not only of the plant, but the plant's relationship to the rest of the world around it. So that's what I mean partly when I say listen beyond. So there's a physicality of the sound, and then the stories, layers of stories that come behind the sound. So I hope when you are out here and beyond, you will turn your ear to trees, to particular trees, and listen for their voice, listen for their particular distinctive accent, and ask what that has to tell you about that tree's belonging in that place. And I'll share a couple of literary examples here of other people who've noted these sounds of trees. One is Thomas Hardy, an English writer, one of his books, Under the Greenwood Tree. He says, to dwellers, so people who live in a wood, almost every species of tree has its voice as well as its feature. In the passing of the breeze, the fir trees sob and moan, no less distinctly than they rock. The holly whistles as it battles with itself. The ash hisses amid its quivering. The beech rustles where its flat boughs rise and fall. And winter, which modifies the note of such trees, shed their leaves does not destroy their individuality. pine trees often are mentioned in works of literature, whether it's prose or theater or poems, because if you look at the sonic spectrum of a pine tree as the wind comes through it, it's very close to the sonic spectrum of the human voice. Many of these other trees, much of their sound is higher pitched than when we're speaking. But pine trees, depending on the pine tree, but most pine trees match the frequency spectrum of human speech. So they're often mentioned as wailing or sighing or whispering because we quite easily analogize ourselves to the voices of the tree. And perhaps the most famous example of that in English literature, at least, is in The Tempest, one of Shakespeare's later and more interesting plays, I think, where Ariel, the spirit, has been locked inside a pine tree for years. And Prospero, the magician, comes and releases Ariel. And so Prospero describes the sound of what it was to have the spirit trapped inside the pine tree. She did confine thee into a cloven pine, where thou didst vent thy groans as fast as mill wheels strike. Thou best knowest what torment I did find thee in. Thy groans did ever make wolves howl and penetrate the breasts of ever angry bears. It was a torment to lay upon the damned. So for Shakespeare, the sound of the pine so matched the sound of the human voice, it sounded like people wailing to escape damnation. I don't quite hear the damnation in it. For me, it's the sound of the mountain, which is a place of exaltation as well as of damnation. So we hear the delights of sensory particularity in the voices of each of the trees, and we can use these differences to find our own direct sensory connection to these trees. Another way we can connect to the voices and the songs of trees is through human music. We often imagine human music to be somehow separate and apart and often above the musics of the rest of the world. But I think that's a false dichotomy, a false division, that our human creativity expressed through music is about the merger of the human with the non-human, or the more than human, as David Abram calls it. And so what we're witnessing and experiencing in music is almost chimeric. Human creativity merging with the materiality and creativity of the living world to produce musics that then join us into community and open our imaginations. And this starts with the materiality of the instruments themselves. A few years ago, I visited a luthier's workshop. So luthiers are people who make violins. And this is a violin workshop in Chicago, 5th generation. So for 5 generations, people have been making violins. And Paul Becker, who was showing me the violin wood that's used for the back of the violins, that his father had harvested in Bosnia in the 1940s from the north side of the mountain, harvested at the full moon so that the sap in the middle of winter, so the sap wasn't rising. It's when you get the best sound from the wood. And here on the workshop table, he had various blocks of maple wood. And you can smell the delightful smell of sawdust and of varnish. And there are lots of little tools for shaping the wood. Even, a violin back is almost as thin as a sheet of paper, getting that wood down to the right thickness and shape. But you start with a big chunk of wood. A violin is exquisitely thin when it's finished. But you start with great big blocks of wood. How do you know which block of wood is going to be good for a violin? Well, he showed me you hold it in one hand and tap, tap, tap on the other end, and you can feel the sound waves coming up through the block of wood into your fingertips. And he showed this block sounds clear, and this one sounds slightly muddy. And so this is a reminder that we hear not only with our ears, but also with the rest of our bodies, the soles of our feet. We hear low frequencies in our chest, and particularly in our fingertips. So we have about 10 different receptor types for different kinds of vibrations and sounds. So we can go up and rest our hands on a tree, particularly when it's windy, and listen to the tree that way. And if you play a musical instrument, you know very well, particularly a one that's made from wood, that a lot of what you're doing when you're playing and worrying about intonation is listening through your fingertips so you can play well. It's through the ear, but it's also through the rest of the body. And the installation here, if you go to the metal armature there and rest your fingertips very lightly, you will hear the sounds that normally would perceive, oh, it's coming through the ears. The entire structure is vibrating, and some parts are vibrating with different notes because of the different lengths of the metal. So Massimo, you provided an opportunity for listening in many ways, bodily listening. Rest your cheek against it, see if you can feel the sound here, but especially with the fingertips, which, because they have evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to all sorts of touch, are great listening devices. So luthiers, violin makers, are listening with their fingertips when they're making the violin. And then when the violin is played, we're hearing the second voice, the second song of the forest. So the reason that particular piece of maple wood is good for making a violin, it has the right kind of grain, the right evenness of the tree's grain that formed on that north side of the mountain. And that's the sound of that place that we're hearing when the violin plays. Of course, merged with the player's skill and artistry as well as the composer's creativity, but the forest is there too, and the character of that particular mountainside is there as well. And of course, here in Italy, the sort of the most famous stringed instruments in the world, of course, Stradivari violins and others from wood harvested just 150, 200 kilometers north of here. When we hear those instruments, we're hearing the voice of the forests from the 16th and 17th centuries. And that was wood that grew before we started burning coal and oil and gas. So we're hearing the song of a pre-industrial earth in many ways, coming from a modern stage. When you go and hear an orchestra, or you go hear like a bluegrass band or a rock band, the same thing, there's wood in those guitars. And even in an electronic keyboard, I have a Yamaha keyboard at home, plastic keys. Where did that plastic come from? It came from oil. The oil is essentially just algae where we've mined from the bottom of the ocean and turned into plastics, and I plug it into the wall and then connect it to solar power or coal power. So I'm hearing in a more indirect way, but even in my synthetic keyboard, I'm hearing the voice of the living earth. So all music is an interspecies merger and a relationship between the human and the non-human. So I hope as you're listening to music, whatever your favorite form of music is, listen to how the music, listen beyond the notes of the music back into the ecological stories that brought the music to the present moment. And I don't think that distracts from human creativity. For me, it makes human creativity all the more amazing. That not only can we craft music within our own species, but we do so by drawing other species in. And of course, that's a large part of what we as a tool-making species, what are our tools used for? They're used for relationship, often to other species. Sometimes it's about consumption, like hunting meat. Other times it's about harvesting wood to make things, to create art, to create possibility and community. We also hear music and the voice of the forest when we hear music being played within a concert hall. So all music is composed in relation to the space that's going to be played. So the wooden organ pipes that we're hearing inside there, we're hearing the voice, the wood there is shaping the note and giving each note its characteristic timbre and its characteristic pitch. But then the sound flows out into the space around, right, which is quite a large and reverberant space. So that particular kind of music sounds great in there. In a concert hall, you would have a little less reverberation. So if you go to a classical music concert hall, there's a certain amount of reverb in there. That reverberation in concert halls is an almost exact match to the reverberation you have in a forest. So when you speak in a forest, a lot of the sound waves bounce back towards you. Every leaf sends sound back. Every tree trunk is an acoustic reflector sending sounds back to us. So sounds come back and they feel a little richer. They have some texture to them that is given to them by the forest. And it turns out that the human ear really likes that. So when we build concert halls, we build them to add the same kind of reverberation. So you play a note or snap your fingers in a concert hall, and that snap or that note lingers for sometimes a fraction of a second, maybe 1 or 2 seconds if it's a very loud sound, which is the same as what's happening in the forest. So I think our acoustic aesthetic, the human acoustic aesthetic, evolved in relation to trees. We like that reverberation because for hundreds of thousands of years, our species lived in a savanna, a place like this, grassy meadows with trees all around. Before that, we spent millions of years, and by we I mean our pre-human ancestors, as primates living in trees. So the evolutionary heritage of humans is to be around trees, and our aesthetics respond to that. That's why we like to plant trees around places that we want to feel relaxed in and feel a pleasant sensory engagement with trees. It's also the reason why we have beds. So I go to bed, I go to sleep at night on a bed. That's a very unusual thing for an animal to do, right? So a dog just lies down on the ground, the bird just perches in a branch. It's only a few tree-living primates that, like the chimpanzees and gorillas, that every night make a bed in the tree. And we've come down from the trees, but we still make our tree bed every night. Right? Sometimes it's a hammock, sometimes it's a bed with a mattress. So even in something as simple as going to bed at night on an actual bed is an echo of our tree-dwelling ancestry. If we had evolved from ground-dwelling creatures, we would just lie down on the ground and sleep quite comfortably, and the mattress companies would all be out of business. So, now, in addition to the personalities of trees that we can hear in their individual voices, and those voices that emerge when we step into a concert hall and hear a forest on the stage, trees are also communities. They always live in community. So if we were to wire up this tree and listen to the ultrasound inside it, we would hear the water flowing through the tree. That's how trees have life. There's water in the soil. The sunlight draws the water up through the tree and out through the leaves, so the leaves stay hydrated and they can photosynthesize and make food. That transport starts in the soil with tree roots connected to fungi. So tree roots don't just end in the soil, they connect out into hundreds of meters of fine fungal strands. And so water moving up through the tree is a product of a living community, not an individual. The tree is in community with fungi in the ground that provide most of its water and most of the phosphorus and other minerals. So the sounds and the manifestation of water moving up trees is a product of a community. If we were to pluck one of these leaves and look inside with a microscope, or put it on a petri dish in the lab to see what was growing inside the leaf, there are hundreds of species of bacteria and fungi inside every leaf. Scientists call this the phylosphere. Phylo meaning leaf, sphere meaning world. So there's a whole microbial world inside every leaf. And these aren't just hitchhikers or accidental creatures that are living on top of the leaf. They're inside the leaf, in between the cells. They protect the tree from drought. They protect from pathogens. They help the leaf have its life. So even if something as simple as a leaf, we give it a name like mulberry tree, that's a simplification. That mulberry tree is in fact hundreds of species all gathered together. Now, there's a microbial dimension that mostly lives beyond human senses, but we humans are part of those living networks. Almost, and this is true now for almost every tree on the planet, the survival and the possibility for good life of every tree now depends on us. And the Mediterranean is one place where that has been true for thousands of years, and particularly through the olive tree. So I've sat with an olive tree in East Jerusalem for many years to try and understand a little bit more about the relationship between people and olives. And for 8,000 years, people have been clearing other vegetation, irrigating, suppressing fire, pruning and taking care of olive trees. So we have been the servant of the olive tree for 8,000 years. They've vastly expanded their range. They lived for millions of years around the Mediterranean as a wild plant dispersed by mostly pigeons and thrushes before we humans came into relationship with them. So we have been their very faithful servants and continue to be to this day. And in return, what do we get? Some of the most calorifically rich, good food that is possible from a Mediterranean climate, where the summers are often hot with not too much rain and the winters are cool and rainy. The olive tree does really well at producing lots of good food, mostly, of course, in the form of oil that sustained human civilization over millennia. So for the last 8,000 years, the thriving of human civilizations in and around the Mediterranean has been possible because of this symbiosis between people and olive trees. So a deep connection over time. And so we have been their servants, they serve us. There isn't a sort of a ruler or a winner there. It truly is a symbiosis between humans and trees. And when the link between human and trees is broken by war or by extended drought, human civilizations collapse, olive trees disappear from the landscape. And we can see this in the historical record. For example, the end of the Bronze Age, there was a collapse of human civilizations that directly coincides with the time when olive trees could no longer be cultivated by people. So the sounds of civilization around the Mediterranean, whether it's sort of on the northern part or in North Africa, all are a product of thriving through people and trees working together. In Northern Europe, a similar story with hazelnuts. You know, we think of hazelnuts as a thing maybe we like to, eat as a condiment, as an aside, maybe in some Nutella. But right after the Ice Age, one of the few trees that could grow across most of Northern Europe were hazelnuts. And people at that time were not cultivating barley or wheat or any of the other annual crops. Instead, they fed on hazelnuts, and archaeologists call this the age of hazelnuts. The sustained human civilization, the first people to migrate north after the Ice Age to Northern Europe, fed on trees and probably helped the trees move north by carrying the nuts and planting them as they went. In North America, the chestnut tree and also acorns have been very important as well. And the chestnut, of course, important here and through into southern France. So this relationship between people and trees goes back a long way and continues into the future. One of the main sources of calories now worldwide are palm oil. So plantations of palm oil that are now being planted, clear-cutting rainforests to plant palm oil. Why? Because people can gain a huge number of calories from a relatively small acreage. So this relationship between people and trees is not just about the olive tree in the Mediterranean, although I think that's one of the prime examples. It occurs across cultures and across times. And our religious imagery picks this up. So if you look in the Abrahamic traditions, the Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights in the Jewish tradition, is a celebration of the olive oil lamp that miraculously kept burning and kept giving life, even when by rational calculation it should have ended a long time ago. That is an ecological story. It's a spiritual story and other forms of story as well. But in Christianity, what does Christ mean? Christ is from Christos, the anointed one, anointed with olive oil. So olive oil is right there in even the name of the religion. And in Islam, God is compared to the light of an olive oil lamp. So these aren't just metaphors, they're actually statements of ecological truth that have found their way right into the center of religious ceremonies about the relationship between people and trees. So again, we think about trees often as sort of separate from humans and away from humans, but in fact, we are always in relationship to them, not just in the oxygen we breathe, but also in the food that we eat many times. Now, this symbiosis is true in cities as well. One of the trees that I learned the most from was a tree in New York City. This is in the Upper West Side of New York City, growing right on the side of a very busy highway. I returned over many years just to befriend this tree. And after it's rained, if you lean your hand on the tree and pull it away, your hand comes away completely blackened by soot. So all the city's pollution gets stuck on the tree branches and twigs and leaves, and so the tree acts as an air purifier that holds on to the pollution, and when it rains, it all washes down to the ground. So the health of our lungs in the city is a product of how many trees there are. So the trees are giving us life in the city, and then we return that life, not just, of course, by planting the trees, but by caring for them. And in New York, there's been an interesting experiment done. They've planted street trees all over the city, and they've studied what happens if you plant a tree, just municipal workers arrive, they plant the tree, and then leave it. Or you plant a tree and you involve people from the local neighborhood in planting the tree. And you put a little sign on it saying, "Hi, I'm I'm a calorie pear tree. Please don't chain your bike to me. If it's a hot summer, bring me some water," that kind of thing. So very subtle, very small little sign. The tree that is planted by municipal workers and left has about a 50-50 chance of being alive in 10 years. Because it's a tough life being a tree in the city, right? Someone's going to drive their car into it and it dries out, or the dogs put too much pee and it gets poisoned by death by dog urine. One of the circles is hell, it includes that. The tree that is planted with people from the neighborhood, nearly 100% probability of survival. Same trees, same size of hole. That tree was given personhood in the neighborhood. People now know it, have befriended the tree, and will look after it more. And so just the simple act of knowing and acknowledging and encompassing trees within our circle of friends gives back the life that they give to us, of course, by cleaning the air and cooling the air. So there's reciprocity between people and trees, even though we're not eating the fruits usually of trees in the middle of the city. Many of them are not fruiting species. Even though we're not eating them, they're still giving life, and we are returning in this symbiosis back and forth. Now, in forests, that reciprocity, of course, involves birds, and in the tropics, monkeys and butterflies, thousands of species. And so listening to the voices of a forest soundscape, thousands of species all calling at once, we're again hearing the second song of the trees, because every one of those animal species is feeding on primary productivity, on the sunlight that the trees have captured and sent into the ecosystem. So in an indirect way, the voices of birds, the voices of insects in forested areas in particular are a product of their relationship with the trees. So that reciprocity continues on out, and it continues, and this is the last example that I'll give, it continues into death. An extraordinary tree that I followed now for many years is a large ash tree that fell near where I used to live in Tennessee. So big tree, about this around at the base. Big windstorm came and it fell over, and I came on this tree almost immediately after it fell. I didn't see it fall. And I thought, well, I'm going to watch this tree as it decomposes, and maybe I'll decompose quicker than it will, or so far we're still in a race. The tree is still there, and so am I. You'd think a dead tree would be a rather boring thing to study over many years, but that place is the most alive point in the entire forest. Why? Because as a tree falls, the smell of the broken wood draws in insects from all around that lay their eggs in that tree. And so when you put your ear to the tree trunk, you hear the sounds of thousands of insects eating the dead tree from the inside. And of course, the birds hear that and they come and feed on it. And the trunk is raised above the ground, this big fallen log. And the bobcats and the coyotes use it as a lookout station and as a runway through the forest. And as a tree fell, it tore open the canopy. So the light is coming down. So wildflowers that would normally grow this tall grow up to my thighs or knees. And the shrubs are growing incredibly fast. So in death, this tree is still a part of the community of life. It's still, in a way, as it's decomposing, it's suffusing its life back into the forest. So even in death, trees have their voices. In fact, they're sometimes even louder because of all those chewing insects inside the dead wood, munching away on them. But even in death, they're loud, they're full of song, and they're full of life. And that life is always about interconnection between the trees and the other beings around them. So I would be delighted to take any questions, thoughts, or comments about your own stories with tree listening or about the work I've discussed here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for being here. And so, I have many questions because, I'm reading your book since a long time. And, of course, I put questions in my mind. So the last one, it's just, I was rereading yesterday a part of the book where you are talking about how, in a way, trees make other things do things for them. You make an example with, but there was a man's or other animal, but there's other the trees, the one you mentioned before, the hazelnut thing, that modify meteorology through sending molecules of perfume where humidity coalescence around and make. So how this can be? How we can't teach this kind of thing to humans. I mean, how can we? How do trees are specialized on this? Okay, because they don't move, but how do they kind of develop this kind of ability to really even influence meteorology?
Yeah, thank you. How can we do that? Well, that's a big question. I don't have an answer to that. But the trees. So what the trees are doing is, every one of these leaves is releasing little molecules, volatile or organic molecules, to the atmosphere. And some of those are communicating to other trees. So there's one called jasminate that we use in human perfume that is an alarm chemical. So if this tree gets attacked by insects, it releases the chemicals that tell the other trees around it that there are insects coming. And those volatile organic molecules drift to the atmosphere and literally cool down the rain. Because as you said, when they get into the higher atmosphere, they become the seeds onto which raindrops fall, and then the raindrops fall back down. Now, whether the question of intention is a difficult one, because in the short range, the tree's intention is to communicate to other leaves and to communicate to other trees around it. But then in aggregate, it then produces the very conditions that the trees need to thrive. So on the longer term, these short-range conversations are creating opportunities for trees to grow by cooling down rain. And the last few tens of millions of years have been particularly important in that when flowering plants evolved, they sent many more organic molecules to the air and cooled down much more rain, and that's where rainforests came from. So before the evolution of flowering plants, there were no rainforests on this planet. There were rainy places, but nothing like a rainforest where it just rains enormous amounts almost every single day and produces extraordinary levels of biodiversity. So in terms of what we might learn about sort of how to be, what we might take away from that, and I think one thing is that the synergy between short-term action and long-term action. We're very good at gaining short-term profit, but figuring out how those short-term interactions can yield not just good things in the short term, but actually play into the longer term to make conditions fruitful and more, grow better soil for, I mean, in a metaphorical sense, for humans and for all others. And that's, of course, a very big ecological and economic challenge.
David, I have not a question for you, but just a quick bridge that I want to open up between you, your book, and Tiziano Scarpa book. Tiziano is a guest, is an active part of this work at the Due Qui project. And back in the days, Tiziano wrote a book that is called Venezia un pesce. Venice is a fish. And he says something that really impacted me as a young student who was moving to Venice. And he wrote that Venice actually is an upside down forest. So I just wanted to also invite, maybe if he wants, Tiziano to give us a glimpse and connect him with you, because you mentioned the life of trees after their living experience. Okay, you mentioned music instruments, but Venice is a place that is physically, economically, and socially made of trees. So, Tiziano, do you want to just tell this story to us, please?
Thank you, Gaia, but I'm so shy to speak in aside. We have David Haskell, we have exploit him, not me. But just few words. I wrote that this city is a sort of inverted city, because it had to be solid, the ground, and so our ancestors planted, reversed oaks and larches, mainly larches and oaks, because in the mud they weren't going to decompose. And so mainly in the softest part of the islands, they had to get the earth more hard, and that's why we can say that it's a sort of reverse inverted forest. And just the last sentence, because I want to listen to David Haskell. And for me, this could be a symbol of what Bruno Latour calls the symbol of what we think modernity is, but it is not, because the cultural project of modernity, Bruno Latour, the great French philosopher, used to think, because he's dead, was the separation of culture and nature. But in fact, modernity produced a lot of hybrid objects and super hybrid object. And this example of urbanistic project of the city, which is very abstract, very full of, I want to build a city with the contrary of nature, because here nature couldn't let me build a city. So with a modern project, I will build a city. It's a sort of my will. Will against nature? No, it's not, because it's a hybrid. You use a lot of wood and of trees. It's a perfect symbol of a sort of objection, of the demonstration that modernity is not a separation between culture and nature, but a hybrid. You know, that's why. And so you had an inverted forest under our feet, and we are in the Arsenale where the ships were trees. In fact, were floating trees. Okay, thank you, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, I know that we don't have much time, but well, thank you so much for being here. It was super to listen to you, and I was wondering, like, if you could tell us a bit more, also, like, of this concept that I was keeping up reading in your books, but also yesterday we were talking about this, of how actually we could think ourselves as a bit serving or servants also to plants and in nature, and how actually human beings are also not used in a way to transport seeds and transport many things, and how can we continue in a way like to look at this perspective that we sometimes, and many times, we forget always. So, well, thank you.
Thank you for that. And yes, I mean, we tend to imagine that we're in charge, right? So we, and our language, our verbs do that, like we domesticated wheat. Well, and the other way of looking at this, and of course others like Michael Pollan and many other writers have pointed this out, that the other way of looking at it is that we are the mechanism that wheat plants have used to clear large parts of the world of forest so that the wheat can perpetuate itself. And the humans are the mechanism by which corn has conquered most of North America. Right? The corn used to be a very obscure plant growing in a few places in Mexico and Central America. And then by tapping into human desires and human senses, sometimes it's for food, sometimes it's for perfume or for things that look beautiful, the plants have, in a way, beguiled our nervous system and drawn us to become their very willing servants, inventing herbicides to clear out all the competition. And for those plants that have done that, it's been a great millennium, because we clever primates have done a lot of work on their behalf. I mean, my own view is more of the language of who's in charge is often not helpful. That I prefer to think about symbiosis, in that a corn or a wheat farmer and the plants they're growing, they're working together, and one isn't controlling the other. They're both mutually interdependent with one another. So if humans go away, all corn and all modern wheat completely disappears. But if corn and wheat disappear, most of us disappear, because 2/3 of all human food calories come from just corn, wheat, and rice. So 3 different kinds of grasses. So we're very dependent on those grasses. And I think a model organism that really demonstrates that for us are lichens. So what's the Italian word for lichen? Anyone? It's the licheni. So with apologies for my accent, where the fungus forms a home for photosynthetic algae or bacteria to live within it, and both are dependent on the other. And 15% of the Earth's surface, mostly in high mountains and at very high latitudes, like up in the Arctic, are covered only in lichen, no other creature. And this is a plant that biologists used to say, well, the fungus has enslaved the algae and so on. It's really, that perspective makes no sense. The two are working together. And particularly the language of enslavement, I think is really problematic, because in a way you can turn that around and use it as a justification for human injustice. You say, well, look, the lichens and the plants are enslaving others, and therefore, well, it's natural, and therefore it's okay for humans to do it, or maybe it's not so bad that humans did it. I think there are multiple logical fallacies along that step, but the first one is viewing these as situations where there's a controlling species and then another species that's being controlled. Certainly there are situations like that in parasitism. Not everything is about harmonious symbiosis in life, of course. There are lots of fungi that are trying to kill these trees by coming through their leaves or coming up through the ground. There are viruses and worms and other things trying to infect us. So I'm not making the case that everything is harmonious symbiosis, but where those convergences of interests arise, the degree of integration is extraordinary. And our own cells are a great example of this. If you look at the human cell, inside every human cell, there is an ancient bacterium that is so interconnected with us that we can't live without it. And most of its genome has moved out of the bacterial cell into our genome. So we're completely entwined. And the green plants have taken another level. They've got two different bacteria. The reason they're green and can photosynthesize is another symbiotic creature. So at the very cellular level, we are all symbionts. And I think that's true, and we've known that now for a few decades, but I think that's true at other levels in the ecosystems as well. And I do think the example here in Venice is a really beautiful one because it challenges most people when they think of Venice, they don't think, oh, immediately trees or an inverted forest. And so it's such a striking example that it has a possibility to break people out of old ways of thinking. And then you can apply that same thinking to, oh, what about my hometown or this other city? In what ways, like New York City was, at least at first, mostly built with pine trees. All those skyscrapers and buildings were made with old-growth longleaf pine from the southern United States that was harvested and shipped north. And so New York City, which again most people don't think of as a quote-unquote natural place, is in fact about symbiosis between people and trees. And to this day, there's 20% tree canopy within the city as well. Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question because it's a way of thinking that I think could change our culture significantly if we think more about symbiosis and partnerships and less about control.
Thank you very much, David.